And it is the 19th of September, a Monday, and we're getting off to a great start this week because today we have, wow, what a great guest for our show, Dr. Patrick Moore, who is the co-founder of Greenpeace and also currently serves on the board of the CO2 Coalition. And he's going to talk to us today about climate change and really a lot of perspectives that I think are of great interest to people here in Oregon, as well as around the country. And we know Oregon is one of these places that considers itself on the cutting edge of all of the things that we hear are supposed to be addressing climate change. Dr. Moore, welcome to the show, and thank you for joining us and taking the time to be with us here tonight.
Thanks for having me on, Kevin. Appreciate it.
So this is probably the single biggest issue aside from the past couple of years with COVID and a lot of public health issues. This issue seems to be the one that shapes public dialogue across the board. It's even the one that seems to truly motivate action by Congress recently to fight inflation, when in fact they admitted afterwards that the bill that they're passing nationally is really supposedly a bill to fight climate change. Tell us a little bit about, your journey, where you started with the environmental movement, what you came to understand about this issue, and the perspective, kind of at a high level, what you'd like folks to know, where you're coming from and what you think.
I'm coming from a tiny floating village on the northwest tip of Vancouver Island in the rainforest where I was on a logging camp when I was a kid, and I learned forestry and I learned nature. And so I was sent to boarding school in Vancouver eventually, because the one-room schoolhouse I went to on a boat every day in Winter Harbor only had about 8 kids in it. And I became a city kid and excelled in life science. Eventually did a Bachelor of Science in biology and forestry at the University of BC, and then a PhD in ecology, before the word ecology was actually in the popular press. But by the mid 60s and early 70s, environment was coming to the forefront, but so was the threat of all-out nuclear war between the United States and the Soviet Union, and the height of the Vietnam War at the same time, 1971.
Oh, yeah.
I joined a small group in a church basement while we were doing our PhD. We called ourselves the Don't Make a Wave Committee, and we went against the US hydrogen bomb tests in Alaska, 5 megaton hydrogen bomb tests. We were just a bunch of kids in a way, but most of us were professional. We were journalists and scientists and lawyers and academics, etc. And we took on the US Atomic Energy Commission and beat them, because we did something by sailing a boat across the North Pacific Ocean to protest the hydrogen bomb tests. We ended up getting on Walter Cronkite's Evening News and having tens of thousands marching in the streets on both sides of the border. When that bomb went off, because we didn't stop that one, people came from both sides of the border and closed down every border crossing between the United States and Canada in protest.
Wow.
President Nixon canceled the remaining 4 or 5 hydrogen bomb tests that were planned early the next year. So with that victory behind us, we took on French atmospheric nuclear testing in the South Pacific. France was still detonating atomic and hydrogen bombs in the air, sending radiation all around the world at that time, whereas Britain and Russia and the United States had decided to go underground quite a few years before that with their nuclear tests. In 2 years, we stopped the atmospheric nuclear testing in Polynesia by doing the same kind of thing, sending boats in there and getting worldwide attention to the problem. Then we took on the issue of the fact that Russia and Japan were slaughtering 30,000 great whales, mostly in the Pacific, in the mid-1970s still. And it took 5 years of voyages, all of which I was on, 3 of which I led, in order to stop this from occurring. The International Whaling Commission banned factory whaling in the North Pacific in 1981. And then we took on the Canadian harp seal slaughter of 250,000 baby seals still nursing with their mothers in the late 70s. That took 5 years to stop that. And then we took on toxic waste in the rivers of Europe in particular. Canada and the United States had already passed decent water and air pollution regulations by this time, but Europe had not. And many of the rivers, including the big ones like the Elbe and the Rhine and the Thames, were basically dead. And we put a riverboat in there and went up and plugged the pipes of the factories underwater that were pouring toxics into the rivers. And today those rivers are alive. So that is where we got to the point where I had been one of 5 international directors for 6 years. But the problem with Greenpeace, because at the beginning, green and peace were put together to say that humanity and the environment must work together. We don't want to eliminate the human species from the earth to save the environment. We care about the human species. We want to stop all out nuclear war. Well, that's the peace part sort of got dropped partway along there, and all there was left was the green. And now my fellow environmentalists were saying that humans are the enemies of the earth, like as if we're the only evil species on the planet.
Yeah, like a virus or something that was infecting the planet.
Well, viruses are much better than
oh, sorry. We rank below virus.
We're the only evil species. It's way too much like original sin for me. Like, I'm not a fire and brimstone guy. I love the earth, love nature, love people. I mean, what other attitude should you have to the fact that you've been born and actually live in this world? Like, what a miracle the whole thing is.
Yeah.
And we are part of nature. We evolved with nature all through the billions of years that nature came from being a little cell in the ocean to being a dinosaur, to being an eagle, to being a human. And we have 1.7 odd million species on this planet today, each one of which represents a continuous successful reproduction since the beginning of life. Otherwise, we wouldn't be here. So we're actually the badass species there are. All the ones that are here now, because they've lived through more time and trouble from volcanoes and the asteroids hitting the earth and extinctions and all the rest. We've survived to this point. And I find just that is a fascinating fact. But the idea that we're the enemies of the earth is a terrible idea to teach our children in particular. And now we've come to the point where we are blaming ourselves for the definite destruction of the earth by burning fossil fuels and producing carbon dioxide. And one of the reasons carbon dioxide works as a scare story is because it's invisible. Nobody can actually see what carbon dioxide is doing. Nobody can look out
too, right?
That's why my book is called Fake Invisible Catastrophes and Threats of Doom, because in fact, all the scare stories are based on things that are invisible, like carbon dioxide, radiation, the bad thing that is supposed to be in genetically modified organisms, GMOs. At least radiation and CO2 are real things, albeit invisible. But the bad thing in GMOs doesn't even have a name. Like, everything has a name. So the truth is, there isn't any bad thing in GMOs. It's a fake thing, totally. Then you come to things that are extremely remote, which might as well be invisible. And that's why polar bears and coral reefs are the icons of the climate change, the Earth will be destroyed movement. Because the average person cannot go and see for themselves. Science is a process of discovery that starts with observation. You see something happening. You say, maybe this is a cause-effect relationship. You do tests and tests and tests to verify that. Then if it works all the time and you see a real cause-effect relationship in your eyes, you put it out for replication by other scientists. And if they can all do the same thing, suddenly you have a theory. That's how science works. But with CO2, there is no verification that CO2 is the so-called control knob of global temperature. Looking back in history, we can see that CO2 and temperature are hardly ever correlated strongly. And when they are, it's for a short period of time. The two most important facts for people to know is that in this era, which is called the Pleistocene Ice Age, it is colder than it has been for the past 250 million years. That's when the previous ice age ended, called the Karoo. It lasted for 100 million years. This one is only 2.6 million years old. We don't know when it will end. But we're at the tail end of a 50 million year cooling period out of the Eocene thermal maximum. Look it up. It's on Wikipedia. You can look up the history of the Earth's climate and the history of the Earth's CO2. So temperature is lower now than it has been through most of life's history. CO2 is lower now than it has been through most of life's history, even with our addition of CO2, taking it from 280 to 420 parts per million in the last 100 years. It was 5,000 parts per million when modern life emerged during the Cambrian explosion period. It has declined steadily in fits and starts, just like temperature has gone up and down. But temperature hasn't declined steadily. It has just gone up and down from warm periods to cold periods, we being in a cold period now called the Pleistocene Ice Age. CO2 has continuously gone down and been depleted in the global atmosphere, and we're adding it back. The CO2 that we are putting in the atmosphere from burning fossil fuels came from the atmosphere in the first place to make the fossil fuels.
Yeah, that's
Those
right.
fossil fuels were made by life. The coal was made by forests on the land, and the oil and gas was made by marine organisms, remains in the sea going into the sediments and gradually deeper and deeper and deeper, and the heat transformed them into hydrocarbons from carbohydrates. Same with the coal, got transformed into hydrocarbons from cellulose and the other things that trees are made out of, and all the other plants that were in the forest with the trees.
Let me ask you something here. How did CO2 then start becoming described? Now you almost get shouted down in a public policy discussion, or even just casual discussions with people like neighbors, like it's described as pollution or poison. Yeah.
CO2 is the basis for all life on Earth. Without CO2, there'd be no life. And CO2 dropped to a level during the last glacial advance 20,000 years ago, which was the most recent one of about 40 glacial advances, and therefore 40 interglacial periods like the one we're in now during the Pleistocene Ice Age. You can look all that up too. It's all very true and easy to find. But the fact of the matter is that CO2 came down to such a low level that it wouldn't have been much longer until it was too low for plants to live at all. Plants don't just need some CO2. Like us with oxygen, if the atmosphere went from 20% oxygen, which it is now, down to 5%, all animals would die. Because animals, the fish in this, I'm talking about land animals, in the atmosphere, not in the ocean. It's a different formula there. But the fact of the matter is that plants need at least 150 million parts per million of CO2 to exist. So basically, life was taking the CO2 out of the atmosphere to make fossil fuels, but secondly, and most importantly, which nobody knows, to make all the shells of calcifying marine organisms. All the limestone, the chalk of the cliffs of Dover, all the marble in all the churches and in the ground was made by life, by calcifying marine organisms, coral reefs being the main ones, but clams and oysters and crabs and shrimp and all of the mussels and barnacles that are in the sea that produce armor plating for themselves, just like a knight in armor puts steel on to protect their soft body. Marine species, when the Cambrian explosion occurred, took them about 50 to 100 million years to figure this out, learned to make these shells for themselves. But by doing so, they began to take carbon dioxide out of the ocean, which then had to absorb more carbon dioxide from the atmosphere because they're in equilibrium. And gradually the CO2 level has dropped over millions of years to where it came to a point where it was going to get too low pretty soon. And so this wonderful invention of creating armor plating presaged the end of life if it continued without us coming along and figuring out, again, inadvertently. They didn't mean to do that. Their purpose in building armor plating wasn't to end life on Earth. It was to protect their bodies.
Sure.
But the same thing, our purpose in burning fossil fuels was not to save the world, but actually inadvertently we have done. And so the CO2 Coalition in Arlington, Virginia is a group of eminent scientists, economists, and thinkers. It's a top-level group. It's by invitation only when people show us their credentials. And a lot of these people are retired and are in a position where they can say what they want without being fired. There's so
That's
much
big, right? That's really big.
censorship and cancel culture going on in this field. It's just unbelievable. And nobody can cancel me, even though they try. They canceled me on LinkedIn, for Pete's sake, which is supposed to be for professionals, not for
Really?
a bunch of leftist hippies. But not that I'm against leftist hippies particularly, but I am if they're pushing this policy of ending fossil fuels, which is 80% of the energy for the whole civilization.
Hmm.
You know, that this is basically some kind of suicide pact if we went forward with that.
You
And
know,
I
and
think
I've heard,
I'd like to come down to specific policies on
yeah,
the side of believing that we're destroying the earth with CO2, which is a total lie. And it's only because people who are benefiting from pushing that hoax, the scientists, the politicians, the Greek media, the activists, they're getting away with it because people can't see it for themselves.
yeah, it's like, as you said, they use the invisible, and then and I think we've seen an element of that take place, and a lot of the confusing information that we've seen about certain viruses in the past few years. And you can just tell people anything you want because
Yep.
they can't see it, they can't reason it necessarily out for themselves, at least in the beginning. And there's been really a lot of people have lost faith, maybe in the people that they always once had faith in, medical science, public health. But long before that started happening to the extent that we now know it's happening in, say, public health, this was happening with climate science a long time ago, wasn't it? I mean, it's
Yes,
been going on for decades.
it's a long-term, uh, I would say it's kind of a part of partly a cult, partly a political movement, partly a fundraising movement, that all of these people have skin in the game to scare us that we're going to kill our children, right? And that makes us feel guilty. So we send a big check to Greenpeace. What are they going to do about it?
Yeah.
You know, the other fact is that the plan they have for reducing fossil fuel consumption is technically and economically impossible, which is wind and solar backed up by batteries. It
That
just is
sounds
not going to
familiar.
happen. Listen to this. If wind and solar operate effectively about 1/3 of the time, so they can supply all the energy we need 1/3 at the time. But if you build only enough wind and solar to supply us with energy reliably 1/3 of the time, how do you provide the other 2/3 of the energy? Well, right now it's with gas and coal and hydro and nuclear, which are reliable and less expensive than wind and solar, despite what they tell you, because they're not telling the truth when they say that wind and solar is becoming less expensive than these other technologies.
Highly subsidized, right? I mean, that's
It's highly subsidized. It's mandated that even if it's more expensive, the utilities have to buy it. And there's huge tax breaks for investing in it. So if a company invests in wind and solar, they can write that off against their other products. So it's totally supported like that. But think if you tried to say you could make enough batteries to back up the wind and solar so that you would have to make 2/3 of your electricity with batteries. But you can't charge the batteries when the wind and solar isn't working. You can only charge the batteries when the wind and solar is working. So now you have to build 3 times as much wind and solar capacity as the world needs, because you've got to charge the batteries while you're supplying all the energy the world needs. It's ridiculous in the extreme. It's a total pipe dream. It will never come true. But anybody who goes down that path is going to get hurt really badly from an economic and perhaps even from a life point of view.
we're
Because
seeing that, aren't we? We're seeing that play out in a somewhat unexpected way so quickly in places like Germany, for reasons that had perhaps suddenly less to do with just trying to stop with fossil fuels, but suddenly having it cut off. And then their fallback plan was like not really all that adequate. There's people running around cutting down trees in Germany and trying to get coal in Poland and to heat their homes
yes,
now.
the problem with Western Europe and Britain is they refused to use their own energy sources and ended up being 80% reliant on Russia, which put a blackmail situation right in front of their face.
Yep.
especially with the Ukraine war. But you can't blame this on the Ukraine war.
No.
It's because those countries refused to frack the gas they have, refused to continue with the oil in the North Sea, refused to build nuclear power plants.
Yep.
And the truth is, the only way to take out a really large portion of fossil fuels is with nuclear energy.
Yep.
There's no other feasible way if you want to get rid of fossil fuels. And I'm all in favor of reducing fossil fuels because they're a very precious resource for airplanes and big machinery that has to move. You can't put a wire on an airplane and put electricity in it.
You can't put a windmill on the airplane either. I've seen some pretty humorous cartoons to that effect.
So, but what you can do is, number one, you can power anything that is stationary, such as a building or a steel mill, with nuclear power. Right now, we're using a huge amount of fossil fuels for providing stationary things with energy, both heat and electricity you can get with the nuclear. In addition, all trains can be powered with nuclear because you can electrify the rails. If a submarine can go underwater for 3 months with 100 nuclear missiles on it with nuclear propulsion, then any big ship on the sea can have nuclear propulsion. There are 6 nuclear navies. Russia has 5 nuclear icebreakers. The technology is well known. Rolls-Royce has been building small nuclear reactors for submarines in Britain for 50 years or more.
Yeah.
Well, the technology is there to do this, but people are afraid of nuclear again because radiation is invisible, and they're told all these scare stories about it.
Yeah.
Right. But if you lay out in the sun for 8 hours naked, you're going to get too much radiation. The sun is just as dangerous a source of radiation as anything in the world is.
Yeah,
Whereas
and you probably have this too, that Irish skin is probably not going to put up a very good fight against that much solar radiation directly exposed. So
exactly, and it's easy to shield the public from nuclear reactors. We know how to do that. It's mostly with concrete, and so there's no, the only nuclear accident that caused deaths was Chernobyl, a stupid design that they did a stupid experiment on and told the operators to shut the safety systems off, and it blew up because it was a design that could blow up like a nuclear bomb. Whereas 3 Mile, and they fixed all that. The Russians still are running some of those Chernobyl class reactors, but they've changed it so it can't do that anymore. Good idea.
Yep.
But all the other reactors in the world can't do that. And 3 Mile Island and Fukushima, the only other accidents, did not kill anybody and were meltdown of the core caused by loss of coolant. Fukushima was a complete botch up by the Japanese, not listening to what other countries were saying about what you should do. They knew tsunamis came to that area. They built the reactors right on the beach 8 feet high from the sea, and a 50-foot tsunami came. They put the backup pumps in case the power was lost to keep the pumps going, to keep the reactors cooled after they shut down. You have to do that for 5 days to keep it cool from the fission products deteriorating in there rapidly.
Long enough to shut down, to cool
long
off.
Enough to stop it from melting. But once it melts, it puts hydrogen gas in the air and all kinds of things. But the backup pumps were on skids in front of the reactors. Just why they weren't even in a shed; they were out in the open. And the diesel tanks to provide fuel for them were also on skids with just a rubber hose connecting to them. And when the tsunami came, it just washed that whole thing away, and the reactor melted down. 3 of them did, in fact. But still, nobody was killed there by radiation because there wasn't enough to harm people. The big mistake they made there was to evacuate the whole of Fukushima. That caused the death of nearly 2,000 people because they evacuated 7 intensive care wards from hospitals into gymnasiums outside the town where there was no facilities to look after these people. So it would have actually saved lives to leave them where they were and import food, of course, because after an accident like that where radiation gets on the crops, you have to wait until it deteriorates to a low enough level. But again, the idea that any amount of radiation is bad for you is a lie, because our bodies have a cellular repair mechanism. Table salt is sodium chloride. If we eat half a cup of that, we die from all the fluids being sucked out of our insides.
Yeah.
But it's an essential nutrient for life. all animals need sodium chloride, and most plants do too, to
Saline
survive.
in your tears, it's part of your bodily function. Plus, I hear most of the time when they talk about CO2, they kind of just drop the O2 part because that makes it sound too nice. They just say it's carbon pollution, which is
Yes,
kind of like saying that table salt is sodium pollution, which is just insane, isn't it?
yes. Well, it's like saying it's chlorine pollution.
Yeah,
So
yeah.
you call salt chlorine from now on, right? Because chlorine gas is very toxic, but sodium
Yep.
chloride isn't chlorine gas. And people don't understand when you put two elements together to make a new compound or molecule, it's always extremely different in its properties from the original one. Like carbon is actually diamonds, graphite, and soot. There were three forms of pure carbon. Oxygen is a gas that the plants are giving off that made it possible for life, for animal life to exist, because there
Yep.
was no oxygen in the Earth's atmosphere until the plants put it there. But carbon dioxide is the life for plants, the life force for plants. It was always in the atmosphere. It came out of the Earth when it was hot in the early years, just like all the water did. Only the water condensed into oceans, and the CO2 remained as a gas in the atmosphere and then into the oceans, absorbed by the oceans to support all the life in the oceans in the early history of life, the plankton, and then eventually the larger species that evolved in the ocean.
It's really ironic, isn't it, that something that tries to describe itself now as the green movement or being green or the Green New Deal, actually it was aimed at trying to deprive plants and trees of the, the life-sustaining substance that they absolutely must have.
Absolutely, absolutely. You see, it's such a great irony that carbon dioxide is the basis of all life
Yep.
and was so much more concentrated in the atmosphere when modern life emerged and flourished and the forests became in existence 260, 300 million years ago in the Carboniferous period. There had been no trees in the world before that.
Right.
So it was when CO2 was extremely high that those things occurred. And we've got to get out of this mess that we've put ourselves in by believing that carbon dioxide is bad. It is all good. It is causing the greening of the earth. All the crops and forests are growing faster now because of our addition of CO2 to the atmosphere. Commercial greenhouse growers all over the world double or triple the CO2 in their greenhouse because they can contain it.
Oh.
They get 60%, up to 60% higher yield by doing that. The optimum level of CO2 for plant growth is somewhere around 2,000 parts per million. In other words, near 5 times what it is now. And when we breathe out, our breath has 40,000 parts of CO2 in it.
Wow.
40,000, that's 4%. And they're saying that 500 is going to cause the world to come to an end.
And melt. Yeah, like it's gonna, and it's kind of interesting because if you don't have enough CO2, then obviously you get less plants, less forestation, but we keep hearing that having higher levels of CO2 is going to cause nearly everything you don't like about weather, but particularly deserts, droughts, a whole list of things that are being described to us as being caused by burning fossil fuels. But it sounds to me like if you don't have enough CO2, you aren't going to have as many trees, and you could end up with a desert potentially.
Well, actually, the Sahara was green during the first half of this interglacial period, so for about 6,000 years, when it was warmer than it is now. You see, even in this interglacial period, it's colder now than it was at the beginning of it. And so there's actually maps showing where all the towns were all across the Sahara, where goat herders, and it wasn't just the oases then, there were actually grasslands all across the Sahara up until about 6,000 years ago when it dried out because it cooled. The world has been in a cooling trend for 6,000 years, even in this interglacial period. And anybody who knows anything about the history of climate knows that to be true. We appear to be at the very beginning of the 80,000 year slide into the next glacial maximum. We don't have to worry about that today. It's like with sea level rise. I say two things to people. You're not going to have to run, right? It's coming up at a millimeter or two a year. And actually, where the glaciers were, like where I live on Vancouver Island, the land is rising faster than the sea is, but because of post-glacial rebound. The mile-thick layer of ice pushed the Earth's crust down a ways, from feet. The sea was 400 feet lower during the most recent glaciation 20,000 years ago. The coral reefs all had to grow up from 400 feet down to where they are today.
Wow.
And that occurred during the first sort of 10,000 years coming out of the glaciation. And about 7,000 years ago, it leveled off and has just been going up and down in little blips since then, because all the big glaciers had been melted by then. But there's still huge caps of ice on either pole, and they are apparently not disappearing as fast as Al Gore said they would.
Yeah.
As a matter of fact, Antarctica had one of the coldest winters since people have been measuring the temperature there this last year.
Yeah.
And the ice in the Arctic did not melt as much as it has been during the last 10 or 12 years this year. So it's actually stayed larger, and it may get larger again next year. These cycles are cycles within cycles within cycles. And we can't even predict the weather 10 days out half the time.
I know. And then they're going to say that they can, but I mean, they predicted 0 out of the last 10 climate apocalypses, which is when people go back and they look at a video of folks naming a year and saying, polar ice cap's going to be melted by then. And all the seas are going to rise, and New York City and Florida are going to be gone. And it doesn't happen. But then they seem to get away with pressing the reset button and then taking a new set of predictions that are just as crazy, and saying this is what we have to do. We have to drop everything and quickly dispense of our own energy production, which, from what I can see, and I'm sure you've spent a lot of time talking and looking at this issue, energy production and our ability to produce energy correlates strongly with prosperity, with longevity, with increasing standards of living. And if we're deprived of the ability to have energy, to heat our homes, to generate electricity, most of which is generated still by fossil fuels, we could end up in something that is going to look like an apocalypse. Because I can only imagine what it'd be like if the electrical grid just was knocked out. We'd be in real trouble.
Well, if you take the two most important things for human civilization and survival, energy and food, I mean, water and oxygen are both food.
Yeah.
But there's no risk of not having enough of those at the present time.
Right.
But there is a risk of not having enough food, that is agricultural production, if countries like Sri Lanka and Netherlands and others start limiting the amount of nitrogen fertilizer that can be used. Because after CO2 and oxygen and hydrogen, but that's water, so it's not a problem.
Yeah.
After CO2, nitrogen is the most important element for life, because all our proteins and amino acids, I mean, a vast amount of our body depends on nitrogen. And nitrogen fertilizer the process was invented early in the 1900s. It won 2 Nobel Prizes, first by the person that invented the process, which is a very complex, high pressure, high temperature process to combine natural gas with nitrogen and make ammonia, NH4, which can then be turned into nitrogen fertilizer, which has made it possible for this many people to live on the earth.
Yeah.
Now, these people who are saying we should reduce nitrogen fertilizer are looking at mass murder predictions.
Yeah, and I've been reading a lot about that lately, because actually, not only lately it's become much more expensive to even as a farmer to purchase fertilizer, and if you can't plant as much acreage, then not as many people get to eat. That's that simple, right? But then they want to ban it, as you said, in the Netherlands and other places. And now in Germany, as I understand it, BASF, one of the world's largest producers of nitrogen-based fertilizers, may be kind of shutting down because they use natural gas as part of that process, as I recall.
Yeah, it's all linked together. And if we see a situation where energy is being reduced as well as nitrogen fertilizer. Energy is necessary to produce our food. If we didn't have the mechanization we have in agriculture, half the people in the cities would have to come back out on the land and pick carrots out of the ground,
Yeah.
right? This is a daunting situation. This is actually a threat to the entire civilization of people on the earth. Now, Russia and India and China and Indonesia and the other South Asian countries and Africa are not buying into this, and neither is most
No.
of South Africa.
Yeah.
It's just the richest Western spoiled countries that are buying into this crap. And that's what it is. It is not a good idea to cause mass starvation and death in our civilization. And that the policies that they're pushing now on fertilizer and energy would do just that. If they would accept nitrogen fertilizer, it's not causing the world to warm up. It's causing all our food to be produced. And if they would please adopt a sensible policy on reducing fossil fuels, if that's what they think they need to do, because it would be a good thing to do in order to preserve them for the future, because they're not as limitless as nuclear energy is.
Sure.
Nuclear energy, we might as well consider it to be limitless. So
Yeah.
instead of 440 nuclear plants, there should be 4,400 nuclear plants. Like,
Wow.
right, get going on it, boys. And okay, that will automatically eliminate a huge amount of the need for fossil fuel because it can be one for one. But now they're saying you can't have natural gas in buildings to do your heating and
Yep.
your cooking. You know what's happening? Those 90% efficient gas heaters, when you put baseboard heaters in, yeah, they're very efficient, but the gas plant that's producing most of the electricity for your house that you have to run them on is only 50% efficient, not 90% efficient. So you're
Oh.
actually going to end up using more natural gas to heat your house and cook your food with electricity than you will from allowing natural gas to go into buildings. It's a totally backward situation.
Well, and in California, where they seem to have stress on their grid from demand right now, particularly during the summer months when there's a lot, warm temperatures and electricity demand goes up for air conditioning. They're saying don't charge your electric car. That would seem to be a bit of a canary in the coal mine. Like they do not have the capacity to make people more dependent on electrical grid. That right now, uh, uh, they don't have the capacity to generate what is needed, or sometimes
They,
even the ability to distribute it.
they have shut down nuclear plants and shut down fossil fuel plants, while at the same time proposing all electric cars, which basically would double the amount of electricity required,
Yeah.
right? And then they're telling people not to charge their cars because there's not enough electricity. And in Oregon, I understand the coal plant that's been shut down,
Yeah.
which is mothballed, they're now planning to demolish it.
Oh, they did. They did it
Did they
last
demolish
week.
it?
They demolished it last week, Thursday. They are burning the bridge behind them. They don't want to have any
They
chance
might have
to
thought to
go back.
wait to see whether this other scheme works
Well,
before they demolish something like that, because
yes.
it costs money to demolish that coal plant. Why didn't they just mothball it?
Well, and then more
Especially
than
seeing
that,
as though you're
they passed a law here in Oregon, and I think it was in 2020, that said that when that coal plant shuts down, it is illegal to replace it with a natural gas turbine electrical generating plant. Illegal. And
yeah, and that would in itself cut CO2 in half. But
it
cutting it in
would.
half isn't good enough for these people. It's net zero all the way,
Yep.
right?
Well, and there's
And
something worse here. You probably know this about Oregon. I think it's somewhere between 40 and 60% of all of our electricity is generated from hydroelectric.
yes,
And they're trying to shut down those dams,
yes, I
hydroelectric
know.
dams.
I'm really lucky. I'm from British Columbia, where we have 95% of our electricity from hydro.
Wow.
Nobody's trying to shut down the dams. My son is working on a new 1,200 megawatt Site C on the Peace River. Good thing about the Peace, it has no salmon or migratory fish in it, which is an issue on Pacific Coastal, I
Sure.
know. But we got to figure out how to work around that, because hydroelectric, where it's feasible, and it's only feasible where it's mountainous and wet. Thankfully, the mountains help make the rain. But
Yep.
in Denmark, where it is fairly wet, it's flat as a pancake. You
Yep.
cannot build hydro dams there. So there's lots of places in the world where you can't build hydro. There's nowhere in the world where you can't build nuclear. You can build nuclear on barges and send it over to Hawaii. The Russians are floating nuclear plants on barges down the rivers that come out of the Arctic Ocean down to cities way in the north that are off the grid now running on diesel electric. So, and once a nuclear plant is on a barge, the cooling water is right underneath it.
Wow, that's amazing. I mean, there's a company here in Oregon, based in Eugene, I think, called NewScale, and they're one of the ones. They're doing newer designs, but Oregon wouldn't let them build anything here, so they had to go to Idaho to actually construct a full scale functioning generating facility.
Saying we have to end fossil fuels and also being against nuclear energy is deranged.
Yeah.
I mean, it is intellectually, scientifically, and humanitarianly deranged.
Well, and there's one other thing that really kind of gets to me about the stuff that is said to us in the news. There seems to be this implied result that we're going to get, that they're going to control the weather if we just do what they tell us to do with all this net zero and Green New Deal policies. What is the chance that they could actually control the weather in the way that they purport to do?
Zero.
Well, that is a really low number percentage.
The weather is in charge of itself. They used to say they were trying to change the climate. Now they think it can change daily weather events.
Well, they keep citing them as the example of why we have to do this.
I know. You know what they say? It's just like calling carbon dioxide carbon. They're not a scientist. They say the fingerprints of CO2 were on that hurricane, like as if there's a hurricane dusting powder. Yes, those are the fingerprints of climate change.
I was going to ask you this in the very beginning, but I think the very first time I heard many of your views, which folks knew about your background with Greenpeace, and then they heard you some years later. I think you spoke pretty strongly about this climate assessment that was put out in, what was that, 2018, and I remember hearing when you were interviewed, you said, I decided that it was time to leave Greenpeace when they started banning elements on the periodic table. That stuck with me. Is that accurate? I don't know if I got that right.
Well, they wanted to ban chlorine worldwide, all my fellow directors, none of whom had any formal science education. And banning chlorine worldwide would mean banning the most important element for public health, which is adding it to drinking water and pools and spas, and also the most important element for medicine, as 80% of our pharmaceuticals are made with chlorine chemistry, and 25% of them actually have chlorine in them, just like table salt. And the reason there's fluorine, chlorine, bromine, iodine, and I think it's atazine, are the halogens. They are all very powerful antibiotics because they're very strongly oxidizing. They attach themselves to anything, and especially to bacteria, and kill them instantly. And so they are really, really important. We don't want people spreading chlorine gas around like the Germans did in World War II. They use it as a chemical weapon. That's not the point. Yes, we should ban chlorine as a chemical weapon, but we should not ban chlorine worldwide. And no element should be banned. As a matter of fact, that's a bit of hubris, because we are not capable of banning elements.
No,
they are here to stay.
The universe is full of them. It's like saying, I think we now have to go out into the asteroid belt and get rid of some elements out there. It's like that crazy, isn't it?
Yeah.
Well, let me ask you. I think we've kind of come up to the amount of time we plan to spend here today, but there's going to be an opportunity for folks to hear from you, and I wanted to bring on with us here quickly the gentleman that helped connect the two of us so that you can come on and speak to us today. His name's Jerry Thompson. And Jerry, I'm just going to add you here. And could you tell us about this event that's coming up on Thursday, September 22nd?
Hello, yes, Dr. Moore and Kevin. Very informative, exciting. It's insane, isn't it? Boy. Anyway, the event is Thursday night, September 22nd at 6:30 to 8:30 at the Springfield High School auditorium. It seats about 600 there, and Springfield right next to Eugene. So anyway, there's access, a lot of parking off 7th Street. So I hope to see whether you're a climate change advocate and think it's human caused, or if you don't. Let's hear informed debate, town hall, where you can, no question is stupid. And Dr. Moore will do his best to, as he has shown tonight, to answer all questions with a little bit of science and humor combined. So anyway, we are going to have 10 college and high school age students asking Dr. Moore questions. And then after that, it'll be open to the audience, or whoever shows up, hoping we can fill the auditorium or close to it. So 6:30, 8:30, doors open at 6, and it's a free event. So we're not charging anything. So that's a good thing too.
Springfield High School Auditorium. I had it on here on the flyer, 875 7th Street in Springfield, and it's from 6:30 to 8:30 p.m. Doors open at 6. It's free, and Dr. Patrick Moore will be there taking all of your questions. And well, it's been really great having you on here today, and I think that folks got kind of a flavor for what they're going to get to hear on Thursday. Also, I wanted to ask one other thing. What would be the best way for folks to follow you, Dr. Moore, and get reliable information, hear the views of folks, say, with the CO2 Coalition, which I did post a link to the website for the CO2 Coalition. And what's your advice on that? Because obviously a lot of the media doesn't really want people to get this information, because that would kind of blow up a narrative that they've been campaigning.
Yeah, Kevin, people follow me on Twitter at EcoSenseNow, EcoSenseNow, with capital letters on Eco, Sense, and Now. And I have 120,000 plus followers on Twitter, and we have a good conversation there. Also, look for my book, Fake Invisible Catastrophes and Threats of Doom, on Amazon. You will find it very informative, easy to read, and I hope you will take it up, because it's got 2,500 positive reviews on Amazon, and it's been accepted worldwide by scientists who know what they're talking about. And I'm being called for dinner.
Could you name the book again? I just want to make sure I get that, folks.
Fake Invisible Catastrophes and Threats of Doom.
There it is. Fake Invisible. Wow, what a title! And I mean, that's actually a great way to remember it. It sounds like a sentence that you would say, except it's really a description of the information you're going to get. So I'm posting that link here in the feed, and I'm going to be making sure that I get that to friends and neighbors too who want to hear more. Thank you again for joining us here tonight. And I won't be able to attend on Thursday, but I think this is going to be a great event. And if folks can make it, you really got to go. Especially bring people that are skeptics, right? Because I think they can ask questions.
All people, anybody who wants to find out a different perspective on this. I'm wide open to other people's opinions. I always have been, and when I learn something new, I change my mind. So I've been a lifelong learner in these subjects, and I gotta go now. And Jerry, I'll see you there tomorrow for pizza.
Yes.
Okay,
All right.
Thank you, Dr. Moore. Thank you, Jerry.
All the best.
Take care, and we will see everybody on the next episode of the Captive Audience. David Darnell and I will be tomorrow night with more information, news, and opinion you can't get anywhere else here in Oregon. Thanks, everyone, and have a great night.
Thank you.